Now, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Extraordinary Plenipotentiary and Deputy CEO of the State Atomic Energy Corporation, Rosatom, for joining us. I want to thank Rosatom and Techsnac Expo Joint Company for the partnership and for your support to this conference. We treasure this cooperation. We value the fact that Rosatom and its affiliates find time not just to export Russian nuclear technologies and services to promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy, but also support the efforts by think tanks and research centers specializing in nonproliferation. This kind of partnership is very important and valuable. Let me remind you that despite the fact that the topic of this presentation would be peaceful uses of nuclear energy, Rosatom and its experts help address non-proliferation crises whenever it is required. One of the examples I can think of, which is a fairly recent example, is JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Actions. So Russian specialists, Russian experts came up with an idea to redesign the Fordo facility. The facility that initially had been planned to be used for uranium enrichment to instead now this facility is used to produce isotopes. So a technical solution was found to resolve a very grave crisis. If my information is correct, the whole issue around Fordo, and this is a huge underground facility, and it took quite some time for all of us to resolve the issue around Fordo. And Russia came up with this proposal. Russian experts suggested to follow the path that we had been using for quite some time, and they suggested that the centrifuges could be used to produce isotopes. So I think this is a good illustration of the role that nuclear energy experts play, not just to further develop nuclear energy, but also to address the crises in non-proliferation we all face. Now, before I give the floor to Ambassador Spassky, I want to mention that Mr. Spassky spent quite some time with the Russian Foreign Ministry. He was head of the North America Department. He was Russian ambassador to Italy, and then he occupied one of the key positions with the Office of the President of the Russian Federation. He was deputy head of the Security Council of Russia. And ex officio, he was responsible for a broad range of security issues. Ambassador Spassky, thank you, and the floor is yours. Thank you, Anton. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, and this is somewhat expected, but I will have to start with the same words that were used by many speakers before me. When Anton planned the dates of this conference, did not mean to specifically identify the same dates as those used by the U.S. administration to revisit JCPO. But this is a fact of reality. Well, such decisions obviously create a certain background for this event. I think that the intent to walk away from JCPOA announced by the American administration by no means undermines the importance and value of this conference and our work. On the contrary, I think this is a wonderful opportunity to send a clear and sound message that JCPOA is a living and working document. Well, of course, it is not perfect. There are no perfect documents in the world. However, there is no alternative to this one. Besides, based on this sad fact, I think we once again should ask ourselves, why don't we utter messages that reflect truth, genuine truth. And this is something that has to do with observing all the necessary provisions, and this is something that contributes to the economic growth and prosperity in the various regions of the world. And now I want to move on to the topic of my presentation. I was tasked with telling you how Russia sees the role and place of nuclear energy in today's world. Obviously, discussion of this kind has to do with the global energy balance and with nuclear non-proliferation. And this is something that is set by the NPT. Let us consider the place of nuclear energy in the energy balance of the 21st century. I will try to be brief because the very framework of the discussion is fairly obvious. I guess the most important trend that we observe here, if we are to identify the most important things, is the fact that humankind needs more and more energy. All the forecasts are relative. There are some forecasts produced by International Energy Agency. I will be using forecasts generated by our American counterparts. For instance, there is a scenario developed by U.S. Energy Information Administration at the Department of Energy. According to this forecast, by 2040, energy use will go up by about 30%. Well, it's a huge number, but not exorbitantly high. But we have to adjust this number because energy sources face increasingly strict requirements. Energy sources must be clean in the broad sense of the word. They must be environmentally friendly, and they should be safe, both in terms of safety, according to IAEA terminology, but also it should be secure. Atomic energy sector meets both requirements. On top of this, which is no less important, new energy sources must be cost-efficient. They must be appealing in terms of economics. We all tend to agree that the green energy holds the future, but very often people tend to believe that green energy is also about wind, solar power, hydro. But look, nuclear energy is also an inseparable component of the green energy balance. And recently, this understanding slowly but steadily gains ground, and we have to consolidate this because this is absolutely crucial. The various green energy sources must not compete. Instead, they must supplement each other, also in terms of attracting investments. There are certain technology requirements. For instance, it's impossible to ensure energy balance by wind and solar energy only. The system may not operate only when sun is shining and wind is blowing. To support routine operation, nuclear energy must be present. And this is something that brings me back to this whole issue of cost efficiency. The most obvious feature here is the cost of fuel. While for nuclear energy, the cost of fuel is very low. It's about 20% plus or minus. Standard generation, coal and gas firing facilities would have the cost of energy close to 60%. Therefore, price volatility produces minimal impact on the ultimate cost of energy produced by nuclear power stations. This is crucial both for investors and for end users. If we had more time, I could have presented other indicators such as levelized cost of electricity. This is something which I absolutely love because this is something that helps you to hide the cost structure, but this is a fine-tuning feature. It's not very comfortable to use some generalized calculations. But once again, as of today, in terms of cost efficiency, nuclear energy outpaces both traditional energy sources, petroleum, coal, natural gas, and such en vogue renewables as wind, solar, and hydros. Today, and for the decades to come, whether we like it or not, well, many may dislike it, but it doesn't change anything. Nuclear energy is the most realistic, tested, environmentally friendly, and competitive alternative to hydrocarbons. Nuclear power stations do not emit pollutants. The contribution of NPPs to greenhouse gases is minimal. The rated capacity of NPPs is over 390 gigawatts. Based on the Paris Accord, the goal is to increase the rated capacity of NPPs by 2050 to reach 930 gigawatts. That's a major step. In fact, we're talking about doubling the capacity. While under such a scenario, the share of nuclear energy in the global energy balance must go up from the current 11% to 25%. This is a very ambitious goal indeed. However, we share this goal. I'm talking about my organization and my country, and we support it. And we think that this is doable. With this, I'd like to move on to another, no less important issue, which Anton has identified. To what extent such a broader use of nuclear energy is compatible with maintaining and strengthening the global nonproliferation regime? With your permission, perhaps I can share my version of an answer. Once again, if nuclear energy sticks to the NPT provisions and to IAEA provisions, and if it meets all these safeguards, it is no contradiction to NPT. On the contrary, this is something that serves to strengthen the global nonproliferation regime. I think this is absolutely key message. Let me give you some illustrations to my point. Now, a broader use of nuclear energy contributes to sustainable development and increased welfare. I'm sorry for this platitude, but if I were to rephrase a famous theory, prosperous and confident about their economic future countries are not very eager to start military adventures. Now, the development of nuclear energy contributes not just to economic growth, but to innovative growth. Countries are able to find their place in the global innovative context. And this is very important in terms of the way the countries look at themselves. And this is also something that helps to shape up the mentality of the political elites. Now, we all know very well that nuclear energy, and I'm a humanitarian, I'm not a technician, it's much easier for me to speak about this in addition to technical, economic, and other differences from other energy sources, nuclear energy has very important psychological difference. Nuclear reaction cannot be seen by naked eye. Nuclear reaction is something hard to comprehend by laymen. Very often, nuclear energy is taken as something esoteric. It's a well-known phenomenon. Nuclear energy traditionally seems to be supported mostly by those who live next door to NPPs. Well, people who don't know much about nuclear energy can be confused and could be alarmed. In order to address this, we have to build understanding of nuclear energy, and with understanding comes responsibility, and responsibility is key to using nuclear energy. The development of nuclear energy in any country whatsoever, including major nuclear states, is unthinkable without international cooperation. Even during the Second World War, the international community of nuclear scientists could not be split into various bits and pieces. While one opposite example might be DPRK. I know of the discussion that you had today, but we all know that the nuclear program of DPRK has its own rich and long history with many components. And the whole thing did not appear out of the blue. Besides, the case of DPRK suggests a different thing. It suggests that any attempt to eliminate a country from the international cooperation process, the sanctions and pressure tend to create siege mentality and various phobias. And such mentality very often results in an attempt to produce some insurance against any attempt to change the regime by outside forces. And, well, plainly speaking, this brings the country to the desire to have a bomb. Now, nuclear energy development follows different cycles that do not coincide with political cycles. Anton mentioned that I started my professional career at the Foreign Ministry of Russia and spent quite some time there. But I joined the Foreign Ministry back in 1983. I was a young bureaucrat at the time, but at that time, South Korean plane was downed over the Pacific Ocean, and the Pershing missiles were about to be deployed in Europe, so tensions were mounting. Since then, the pendulum had a number of swings both ways. This may not sound very reassuring, but I'm pretty calm about the current aggravations and the various sanctions-related issues. This will also pass, as King Solomon's ring suggested. Now, cycles in nuclear energy are much longer. It takes 5 to 10 years to build a modern nuclear power station. The operation of a nuclear power plant based on the initial license, I'm talking about P+ generation, such units may last for 60+ years. Decommissioning, another 10 years. So, on average, we have the figure of 100 years. This is a life cycle of one facility. One single facility, 100 years. Now, throughout this period, or during the most part of it, nuclear fuel is delivered, spent fuel is removed, training is performed and so on and so forth. And this process involves thousands of people, both in the country where the nuclear power plant is located and in the countries that supply technologies. All this creates, in reality, a very strong safety net. It creates an insurance. It creates stability and predictability. Countries that develop nuclear energy are very much interested to maintain stability, both within the country and globally. They may not be aware of this, but this is something that happens in real life. Now, let us look at what Russia is doing in today's world in order to promote and advance nuclear technologies and strengthen the non-proliferation regime. Thing is that these are not two parallel tracks. In fact, this is one and the same process, and these two parts are intimately related and indivisible. At the moment, at a given time, we are building, and I stress this, we are building 16 nuclear power plants in 6 countries. We are in the course of preparation for building 7 more units in 3 countries. And by preparation, I don't mean some musing and pondering over. No, I'm talking about some actual work being done on site. We have legally binding documents to build 34 units in 9 countries. No other player globally has such a portfolio. Once again, I'm talking about units of 1,000 to 1,200 megawatts capacity. We have 3 Bibles, if you will. I'm referring to the additional protocol. The launch of national nuclear programs by any country, irrespective of whether such countries want it or not, immediately triggers the need for such countries to enter into the additional protocol. Next comes the Convention on the fissile materials protection and respective amendments. This is a major tool to bolster up the global non-proliferation regime, and it is as important as the additional protocol. It is regretful that we did not pay sufficient attention to its coming into force. And finally, it's the code of rules and guidelines that refer to the export of nuclear technologies. In fact, all the documents that cover our overseas operations are open to public. They are available on respective websites, so I encourage you, just out of curiosity, look at one of our most recent agreements, and all the export control requirements are set forth by such documents. I want to emphasize 3 most obvious ones. First, there's a requirement to ensure safety for units and components at the level of no lower than the one imposed by the IAEA. Then all the equipment and all the fuel should be supplied under the IAEA safeguards. And finally, we must commit not to transfer any units or technologies that would enable various countries to enrich uranium or produce heavy water. And in the course of the past few years, we apply such requirements in the strictest possible manner. Now, in 2013, we introduced 2 major innovations. Madame Belaeva, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, cherishes those innovations dearly. I'm referring to the nuclear infrastructure. We've always helped our partners to develop their nuclear infrastructure. It's impossible not to do this, but this year we launched a systemic effort. Since 2017, we've been contributing to the IAEA in the amount of over 1 million euros to support this. One may think, oh, we're talking billions. What about 1 million? It's peanuts. But let's not forget one very important thing. The money contributed to international organizations, especially to professional organizations, well, this money produces a major multiplier effect. Well, the amount appears to be fairly modest, but again, this is just a seed money. We already deliver a series of capacity-building events together with the IAEA, and we expose new countries to such training, and, which is important, all this is done according to the IAEA requirements with respect to 19 components of the nuclear infrastructure. Besides, we uphold the fundamental principle. Whatever we do in our international cooperation, we do in line with the recommendations and provisions of the IAEA. Now, security, physical security. We know, and our colleagues from the Foreign Ministry would also know, that providing security in general and protection in particular is a sovereign responsibility of any country, and this is our principal position. It is crucial for us, especially given the fact that we see many attempts to dilute this interpretation. However, this is something that belongs to international law, and this is something that reflects our stance, and this has always been our stance. However, the global situation, how should I put it, is not terribly stable. So taking into account this, and based on many requests coming from our partners, we made a very serious decision this year.
We are ready to offer systemic support to countries for which we build nuclear power plants. And we offer to build nuclear security elements. The responsibility for final nuclear security and for physical protection systems is with the country where the power plant is located. However, we offer technology and equipment. Believe me, this was not an easy decision to make for us. We are talking about very delicate, very sensitive things that are very close to confidential and secret levels. I realize that we need time for questions and answers. In conclusion, I would like to make 3 points. They are of principal importance. If I repeat myself, please bear with me. You can believe me or not, but that's what our stance is based on with regard to peaceful use of nuclear energy. 1, we believe that nuclear energy is destined to be an important part of international energy balance, at least until the end of the 21st century. What is going to happen after that? I like science fiction, but not in this context. Thermonuclear reactors, hydrogen reactors, nice concepts, but let's not talk about it in a technical context yet. 2, Russia intends to not just participate but be a leader in the world energy market. That is our national policy. We do not fear competition from the Americans, from the French, from Germans, maybe in some time from the Indians and other people. We believe that competition is an essential part of technology development and progress. And let me tell you frankly, there's enough space for everyone, as long as we comply with the security requirements. Everybody should. Competition may take place through different things and at any place, but it's not something that we could sacrifice when we're talking about security. One more time, and we'll mention one point that I already made. All along, as we worked internationally, we work in complete compliance with IAEA guidelines. This is our policy. That's the way we have been acting, and we will act so in the future. Thank you. Thank you, Nikolai. We have 12 minutes for 3 questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We're going to take all 3 questions, and we will ask Nikolai to address them. Oleg Tarikov and Elion Ratz. And Hans Blix, that will be the 4th question.
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Ali Ahmad. I'm a Lebanese academic. And also thank you, Anton, for this great conference. Ambassador, you have given a broad overview of nuclear energy, but if I may, I would like to ask you about your perspective, or Rosatom's perspective, of the Middle East projects. So you have been seriously linked with 3 projects in Egypt, Jordan, and in Turkey. So I would really appreciate if you can give us the status or progress on these projects, particularly the Jordanian one, because there has been some delays and there has been some talks about financing. So if you could please elaborate on the challenges of Rosatom's investments in the Middle East. Thank you.
Tariq.
Thank you very much. Tariq Roque, formerly Coordinator for Nuclear Fuel Assurances at the IAEA. Thank you very much, Ambassador Spassky, for your wide-ranging speech. It's very nice to see you here. I had 2 questions for you. You'd mentioned that the current range of nuclear power plants for Russia was 1,000 to 1,200 megawatts electric. In the past, there was talk about small and medium reactors and transportable reactors. And I was wondering whether you might have something to say on the future of small or modular reactors. Secondly, you led the Russian effort, together with the IAEA, to establish the IAEA Low-Enriched Uranium Reserve at Angarsk, which became functional in March 2010. We don't hear very much about it, and I was wondering whether there were any plans to publicize the availability of this 120 tons of low-enriched uranium available in Angarsk. And now that we have the IAEA LEU bank coming up as well, we do have a secure assurance of supply for the front end, but there is still a shortage of cooperation in the back end of dealing with spent nuclear fuel, and you touched upon that in your comments. And do you think there is scope for Russia to propose an initiative through the IAEA for multinational cooperation in dealing with the back end? It's been 10 years since a nuclear fuel cycle event was held at the IAEA, and perhaps now might be a good time for Russia to take another initiative here. Thank you.
Leon Ratz, Nuclear Threat Initiative. Leon Ratz.
Hello, Leon Ratz, Program Officer with the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Thank you very much for your remarks, Mr. Ambassador. During your speech, you mentioned that the cycles pertaining to nuclear energy often outpace and are certainly far longer than cycles related to political relations. So towards that end, my question is on, I wanted to ask you your thoughts and your perspectives on potential for cooperation between the Russian Federation and the United States on issues related to nuclear energy and nuclear security and nuclear safety. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. Dr. Blix.
First of all, I appreciate that our hosts are also hosting a session on nuclear energy, because that's in your mission. The second point is to congratulate the speaker on his very detailed and convincing arguments in favor of the nuclear energy. I agree with him completely that at a time when we all fear global warming, perhaps as the most urgent threat against humanity, together with the nuclear weapons, the global warming is something that we need to take care of. And nuclear energy is able to generate enormous amount of energy, electricity and heat, without any emission of carbon dioxide. Now, in those of us who live in Western Europe and who see much resistance to nuclear power and the argument that the renewable sources will be sufficient and that we don't need it, and Germany is actually going ahead in that direction. For those of us, this is an interesting question whether it's credible that the renewable can stand the whole thing. I do not think so. I think with you, then I agree, convinced that yes, we need energy also when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. But there is an interesting question that is about storing of energy. We know that renewable, the hydro, yes, Mother Earth helps us to store the energy there, and it doesn't store solar energy and wind power. But there are modern methods of trying to store it, and I would like to, if they succeed, if the batteries can get, electric batteries can get much greater capacity, or if you can use hydrogen to store energy, then I think the renewables will be in a better position to argue the competition with the nuclear. I would like to hear the view on the future of that. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, Dr. Ahmad, thank you very much for your question. A most relevant question. Let me divide it sort of in two parts. First, speaking broadly about Middle East, all the things which I mentioned, all of them apply first and foremost exactly to the zone of Middle East, because probably it's the most accident-prone geographical zone in the world currently, and nevertheless, quite a lot of countries are promoting nuclear energy. Some of them are doing this thing together with us. Some of them, for instance, the United Arab Emirates are doing it together with the Koreans. It doesn't matter. The Saudis are making up their mind with whom to proceed. So I'm making a point. It's a crisis-ridden zone, but nevertheless, if applied responsibly, nuclear energy helps not only economic well-being of this huge zone, but political stability as well. First and foremost, in terms of inducing responsibility. Speaking about the specific projects, well, as you know, of course, I'll give you very, very briefly as a broad picture. But since every single one of them is a bilateral project, there is a golden rule which applies to the construction of nuclear facilities. In the final analysis, the country which calls the shots is the country on which territory this nuclear facility is situated. So you'll excuse me if I will not go into the details. But I can tell you that the Turkish project, even though the country is not exactly in the Middle East, is the one most advanced. We are actually working there on the so-called hydrotechnical facilities. We are quite well advanced, and effectively we are moving towards the actual launch of the construction. And by the way, for me it's a very special project because I was the head of the delegation and the official negotiator for my government for the conclusion of the intergovernmental agreement for the construction of the Akuyu nuclear power plant. It was the first ever agreement of a kind because usually and previously we practiced, and not only we, that was the practice of the day, the so-called turnkey arrangements. In this case, it's a BOO. So I'm very happy that it's moving us forward according to the schedule. And I'm absolutely sure that these 4 huge units are going not only to contribute electricity to Turkey, but also to create a very particular precedent of the feasibility of these kind of economic arrangements for the construction of nuclear power facilities. Egypt, we are also approaching the announcement for this start of the work. Effectively, all the documents are in place. Jordan, yes, it's quite advanced, but from the very start, the Jordanians said that they were envisaging this project in 2 stages. The preparatory stage to evaluate the technical feasibilities of such things as the seismic arrangements, the water supply, etc., and besides, of course, the economic feasibility of the project. So, yes, it's taking more time because it was envisaged from the very start. They wanted it this way. We are perfectly comfortable with this arrangement. And by the way, those are not the only countries contemplating the use of nuclear energy. I'll give you just one example. Last week I had the honor to be on the delegation of our Prime Minister, Mr. Medvedev, on his official visits to Algiers and to Morocco. And in both countries, we signed specific initial documents for the promotion of the preparation for nuclear energy applications. In particular, personnel training. This is absolutely pivotal. I was very glad to hear the questions of my good old friend, Mr. Rauf. Of course, he's an extremely smart person. That is, he mentioned 2 questions. Actually, there were 3 of them. Never mind. Well, speaking about the small and medium reactors and the transportable nuclear power plants, well, my boss, Mr. Likhachov, already made the announcement, so I can repeat it. Next year, we'll be arranging for the transportation of the first ever in the world transportable floating nuclear power plant, Academician Lomonosov, from St. Petersburg to Murmansk. Besides, responding to the concerns from our own non-governmental organizations and from our Scandinavian friends, even though it's perfectly legal and perfectly safe, we will be arranging for the transportation of this floating nuclear power unit without any fuel on board. The fuel will be loaded at Murmansk. So, while it will be following international sea routes, there will be no fuel there. Small and medium-sized nuclear reactors, we are working on them. Once again, it depends on what we define by small and medium. For example, we all know that one of the most successful ever newest NPP designs in the world is ours VVR 440, by the way, constructed at Paks in Hungary and Sloviisa in Finland. But, of course, smaller implies smaller. We believe that there is great potential here because the request is appearing and it's going to grow for different reasons. It's a long conversation, but I believe that's one of the most topical topics ever. So we are working on it, and we are very happy that the IAEA is taking a lead in getting in depth into the possible criteria for the promotion of this kind of nuclear reactors. Then your next question. Well, Mr. Rauf, sometimes you said that not much is heard. To tell you the truth, if there is an initiative and then not much is heard about this initiative, one should be very happy about it. That means that this initiative is perfectly alive and kicking. So I can assure you that this 120 tons of low-enriched uranium sitting on the site of this Angarskiy's enrichment plant. It's perfectly comfortable, quite happy. It's there, ready for use anytime, any place, at the command, at the signal from the headquarters of the IAEA. And forgive me if I make an example, which I remember definitely both of us made in those longest going into the night discussions that we had on this matter. Effectively, it's like the nuclear deterrence. If it's never invoked, that means it works. And the same applies here. If this guarantee reserve, or putting it simply, nuclear fuel bank, if it is not invoked, that means its very existence is helpful, and the nuclear as a fuel market, international market, works by itself, driven by the market forces, and doesn't need any political intervention. But nevertheless, having this stockpile as the last resort instrument is very useful. Shortage of cooperation on back end. Well, forgive me if I remind all of us that the initial initiative of President Putin referred not only to nuclear fuel per se as the front end. It referred first and most to the nuclear fuel cycle as a whole. So, I would say that definitely the need for international approaches to this particular segment of the nuclear fuel cycle is perfectly there. It's extremely timely. I remember that while at the headquarters of the IAEA, you were doing quite a lot to promote discussions on this topic. Why it's been lagging behind? If I express my personal opinion, I believe for two reasons. First, nuclear waste, well, among specialists to say back end, it's a perfect definition. Perfect. Sounds nice. Speaking in simpler terms, like nuclear waste, it's sort of, without proper explanations, it's disturbing somewhat to the public opinion. So, what is needed, and that's exactly what I was talking about, promoting public acceptance. It's tougher, it's doable. We are doing it together under the guidance of the IAEA. Second point, excuse me if I'm cynical just for a little bit. Previously, the business opportunities in this particular sphere were not exactly very evident. Now, it's becoming a very promising business. There are billions of bucks there. And when there is money, usually things start to move. So I'm very positive. Well, as my colleague from the United States, Mr. Ratz, very briefly, our understanding of the situation in the nuclear-related cooperation with the United States was most extensively elaborated by my president, Mr. Putin, yesterday. So I have little to add. It was not us who invented this kind of situation. Unfortunately, it was the United States. The United States froze the operations of the Presidential Commission. And I have to say that the working group on nuclear security and nuclear energy, my colleagues from the other fields, I hope they are not hearing me and will not get spiteful, but I believe that was the most active and one of the most effective working groups in the whole framework of the Commission. It was working. It was co-chaired on the US side by my good friend, I still reiterate it, he remains my friend, Dan Poneman, once he's been as a participant in this conference. So we were doing fantastic work. It was frozen. Then we were officially informed that the United States is freezing all the nuclear cooperation whatsoever. The letter is still there. So you are asking what do we think. As I said, I lived long enough, so I'm quite positive. I believe that sooner or later, hopefully, sooner we'll arrive at a juncture when we will be relaunching our cooperation. Thanks God we still have the basic instrument, the 123. It's perfectly there. You mentioned nuclear safety and nuclear security. You know, it's the same thing as one cannot cut, for instance, the airspace in different sections. One cannot pick at random something in which one side is interested and say, look here, we are keeping frozen everything, but on this particular 3.5 issues, we would like to do something together. I don't think this approach is going to work. The cooperation will be relaunched as a whole, including nuclear safety and nuclear security, which is actually a very vital topic. I absolutely share it. And we were doing fantastic things together. Some of the things we are still doing. Thanks God, certain venues of cooperation were not scrapped, like the repatriation of this highly enriched fresh and spent fuel of nuclear research reactors. We are still doing it, but unfortunately not much. Of course, for me, it was a great honor to hear the comments of the Director General Blix. Well, he's one of the greatest figures in the field, so I can hardly add anything to what he said. I prefer not to comment on the national choices of certain of our partners, even when, from my conscience and my mentality, I disagree with them. For me personally, for instance, it's a pity that Germany opted out of the nuclear business. For instance, I had a chance to be visiting on numerous occasions, and I remember with my Iranian friends recently at the Tuesday seminar which we were having this episode, I had a chance in line of my job to be a frequent visitor to Bushehr nuclear power plant. And for instance, when I saw the pieces of equipment integrated into the project, originally designed and created by the Kraftwerk Union, after 20 years, under extreme conditions of the local climate, Persian Gulf, etc., the war raging nearby for 10 years, missile strikes, etc. And nevertheless, they were perfectly integrated and were functioning. So for this kind of country to opt out of nuclear business, it's a pity. On another point, forgive me, but thinking of France sitting nearby and being the foremost producer of nuclear-generated electricity, and just a few kilometers separating these nuclear power plants from German soil. And the same thing, by the way, applies to Italy and the same France, to Massilia. So we understand there is policy, there is politics. It's not up to me to judge their political choices. If they can afford it, so much the better for them. But the majority of the world, unfortunately or fortunately, cannot afford this kind of choice for the foreseeable future. That is why I was sharing my conviction and the policy of my country that nuclear energy, safe, and proliferation secure, will be staying with us for quite some while in the 21st century. Speaking about the resumables, well, Mr. Director General, you said it yourself. Of course, they are getting better. There is no denying it. Of course, and by the way, this is a fantastic characteristic, very relevant to our discourse. Of course, the cost of established capacity, because this is a way to judge. There are two actually characteristics: the cost, the price of established capacity, and there's the price of produced kilowatt hour. Of course, these characteristics are improving in a very significant way through the recent decade regarding the resumables. But once again, I don't see the resumables and the nuclear energy on different competitive tracks. We are together there. And the advantages of these different kinds of energy lie exactly in their synergy and their combination. And that is why, by the way, recently, my organization, Rosatom, been actively moving into this field. We are already participating in the business of wind generation, and I hope we will be doing more. So that's it, essentially, and I would like to thank once again Mr. KHLOPKOV. It's a very relevant, very timely initiative. It's always a pleasure to meet old friends. It's always a very serious, substantive discussion. But besides this time, I believe what is most required is a clear political signal regarding nuclear energy as a whole and JCPOA in particular. Thank you very much. Спасибо большое.
Спасибо, Николай Николаевич, за то, что нашли.
Ambassador Spassky, thank you so much for finding time to speak to the audience. And thank you very much for this overview and for sharing with us the way Rosatom views prospects for nuclear energy and the plans of Rosatom in terms of international cooperation. As you suggested, Rosatom has outpaced all other major players in the market in terms of building light water units and in terms of designing innovative features such as floating power plants. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for taking up too much time and having you to stay with us longer. Would be extremely pleased if you find time and opportunity to participate in our future events whenever this might coincide with your professional interests and your schedule. Thanks a lot.
Dear colleagues, we will continue session with no break. So yeah, this is the price. If you would like to have with you Deputy Director General for extra 15 minutes, you don't have a break. So,
Cruel and unusual punishment.
but again, it was in our agenda that we don't have a break because we will continue with the session on peaceful use of nuclear energy. So please, speakers, be invited to be on the podium. My colleagues will arrange it very quickly.